Thank you for watching the American Numismatic Society's YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like our online resources, publication, and events, you can support the Society by becoming a member. And don't forget to check out our book and eBay stores. The links are below.
So my name is Peter Weiss, and Steve Scher is the other half of this presentation, and he's going to go first and give you all a bit of a synopsis of 17th century Dutch history and how metals played an important role in that, and then I'll follow up with that with a more specialized area. Steve?
Thank you, Peter. I wanted to thank the American Numismatic Society for having my participation in this event, but I'm particularly grateful to Peter for inviting me to join him during this presentation. I also think that there may be some Dutch friends and colleagues who are listening in, and I wanted to welcome them warmly on this bitter cold day. During the course of more than a century, the 7 provinces of the Netherlands achieved an astonishing dominance in almost all fields of endeavor. While engaged in a bitter 80-year-long conflict with Habsburg Spain, during which they achieved independence in 1581, the Dutch managed to construct a delicately balanced federal form of government dominated by the province of Holland, and in clear contrast to the absolute monarchies that surrounded them. In addition to the legislative bodies or states that governed each province and the states general that acted for the nation as a whole, theoretically, each province was also governed by a stadtholder chosen by the states. In fact, normally throughout this period, one member of the House of Orange was generally named to all 7 stadtholderships and also appointed general of the armies and admiral of the navies. As this governmental structure was being forged amidst almost constant warfare, not only with Spain, but later with England and France, a remarkable culture was also emerging based upon enormous riches that flowed in from a vast commercial empire, sustained by a powerful navy and by the efforts of an enterprising, shrewd, often daring, inventive, and tenacious people. Standing embattled against their neighbors and at the same time realizing such phenomenal success, not surprisingly engendered a sense of well-being, of superiority, and ultimately of being a nation chosen by God. The extraordinary achievements of a people whose basic values and beliefs were grounded in the Protestant religion and to a great extent in Calvinism resulted in a curious amalgam of sobriety and indulgence. Dutch art of the 17th century is dominated by painting, in which many subjects from contemporary life, history, mythology, and religion are depicted with a realism expressed through highly developed techniques that had evolved since the 15th century. During a period in which art has generally been classified as Baroque, Dutch painting assumed a unique position, while sculpture and architecture played a secondary role. On the other hand, luxury goods, such as textiles, silverware, furniture, and jewelry, were produced or imported to satisfy a market made active by great wealth. Within this environment, the commemorative metal played an essential role and was used, in fact, to record or mark not only famous persons and significant events, but key moments in everyday life. Within the closely constrained borders of the 7 provinces, importance was given to every achievement and to each triumph that confirmed the preeminent position held by the Dutch during this brief period of glory. The earliest medals that appear in the Low Countries were made for the court of the Dukes of Burgundy in the last quarter of the 15th century. Particularly noteworthy among these are the medals of Giovanni Candida, a Neapolitan courtier, secretary, and diplomat who worked for Charles the Bold of Burgundy, Maximilian I of Austria, and Charles VIII of France. Although difficult questions of attribution surround this amateur medalist, His influence was considerable and is typical of the way in which the metal was imported into France and Low Countries by Italian artists. The metals produced in the Netherlands during this period display a combination of Italian delicacy and sophistication with realistic portraiture drawn on local traditions and influences from German medallic art, where the emphasis was almost exclusively focused on the unembellished portrait. In 1519, the great Antwerp painter, Quentin Matsys, fashioned a medal of the celebrated humanist Desiderius Erasmus. Next, please. In which sensitivity of portraiture, perfection of composition, elegance and disposition of the inscriptions, the eloquence and power of the reverse emblem and subtlety of modeling all combine to produce one of the masterpieces of Renaissance medallic art, an art that, though fully mature in Italy, was in its infancy north of the Alps. Yet the Erasmus medal is something of an anomaly, and it is not until later in the 16th century that the work of Italians, next slide please, in Ghent and Antwerp, helped create an enthusiastic demand for medals, not only among princes and their followers, but also on the part of important private individuals. Such leading sculptors and medalists as Leone Leoni, Jacopo Nizzolo d'Arezzo, Giampaolo Poggini, and others traveled from Italian centers under Habsburg rule, particularly Milan, to other capitals in their territories, including the Low Countries. Typical of the strongly Italianate nature of Netherlandish medallic art during the 16th century is the work of the sculptor Jacques Jongelink. Next, please. Who worked for a time in Leoni's studio in Milan and whose medals are rarely signed, but to whom may be attributed with certainty over 100 pieces. Precision of detail and elegance of presentation in a highly accomplished technique are often fused with precise portraiture. Next, please. And reverses that vary in quality, but are for the most part composed and executed with skill, showing the strong influence of the Milanese school. Next, please. In at least one case, the medal of Anthony van Stralen, dated 1565, the reverse image of Fortune attains a most impressive level of beauty. Most of the medallic production in the Catholic Low Countries in the second half of the 16th century and beginning of the 17th centuries was associated with the courts of great noblemen and princes of the church in Antwerp and Brussels. The 7 provinces of the Dutch Republic did not provide a similar environment, and the prosperity of a sober middle-class society grew only gradually. By 1630, the proceeds of successful international commerce, beginning with the domestic fishing industry and trade with the Baltic, had expanded to an international market in luxury goods. It was at this time, and in conjunction with the wide development of silversmithing, that for the next 50 years or so, Dutch medallic art flourished in a way quite distinctive from equally prolific activity in other countries. Because of the type of machinery involved in the production of coins, struck medals have usually been the responsibility of official mints. In the Netherlands, the individual provinces issued small pieces in low relief, next please, marking the many important events of the War for Independence. After 1615, letters patent were granted to die engravers, enabling them to produce and sell medals independently, responding to a widespread demand for souvenirs of important events and famous people. Those who could afford them bought medals made of silver, while others were content with small tokens in copper or bronze containing the same images. With the growth in prosperity and significant developments in myth and technology, struck medals increased in size and in the complexity of their imagery. Within this context, few medalists are as important and productive as Sebastian Dadler. Born to German parents in Strasbourg in 1586 and trained as a goldsmith, Dadler worked in a succession of cities: Augsburg, Vienna, Dresden, Gdansk, and Hamburg, where he remained until his death in 1657. Although he never worked in the Netherlands, he produced several medals with Dutch subjects, and his influence on Dutch medalists was considerable. His mastery of die engraving was without equal, and he perfected new methods of striking that enabled him to produce complex and minutely detailed scenes covering a wide variety of subjects. His medal marking the arrival of Princess Mary of England as the bride of the future William II of Orange conveys in almost excessive terms the characteristics of his style and technique. In this medal, he must have been required to include every possible symbol, allegorical figure, and descriptive detail related to the subject. The obverse celebrates the leadership and military prowess of the Stadtholder Frederick Henry, Prince of Orange, who sits upon a throne like an ancient emperor in triumph, dressed in a combination of contemporary garb and Roman armor, brandishing a sword in one hand while displaying the arms of the 7 provinces in the other. A clear reminder that his power derives only from the will of the Republic, whose enemies lie prostrate at his feet. The reverse commemorates one of the most significant acts of the stadtholdership of Frederick Henry, and one of the most important for the House of Orange, the liaison with the British royal family in the person of Princess Mary Stuart, daughter of Charles I. From military, naval, and political superiority, we turn, literally, to peace and prosperity, as well as love and dynastic solidarity. The wattle fence reminds us of the inviolable borders of the Dutch Republic, the entrance to which is approached by Mary, who holds in her hand a conspicuous rose, the flower of Venus. She is welcomed by William, who strides forward from inside the fence, whose entrance is straddled above by the defiant Belgic lion, sword in one paw, the 7 arrows representing the 7 provinces in the other. While against his chest rests a lance bearing on its tip the cap of liberty found so often in Dutch imagery. Within the fence, Dodler's hara vacui is demonstrated once again on the remainder of the surface, where prosperous burghers stroll through orderly gardens, and industrious laborers carry the goods that are stacked before a warehouse, ready to be placed aboard the many ships that dot the distant ocean. This exuberant display of the enviable conditions of life in the Republic in 1642 is given a final Baroque touch at the top, where putti lean from clouds to pour all manner of riches down upon the fortunate land below. The legend above is an invitation to Mary, quote, "Enter, divine creature, the bower where Mars and love invite you here. Under your patronage, liberty shall produce her fruit," close quote. The mingling of mythological figures, allegory, historical personages, scenes of everyday life, Baroque staffage, and honest portraiture is a constant feature of Dutch medals in varying degrees. References to antiquity were also popular, and their association with contemporary events, situations, or persons lent the same dignity and validity to the subject as did the well-known equation of the Dutch with Old Testament Hebrews as the chosen people. We find this repeatedly in some of the large struck pieces by Dutch medalists. Next, please. Jurien Poel's medal, celebrating the inauguration of the new town hall in Amsterdam in 1655, is a marvelous case in point. 7 united provinces there may have been, but 7 equal provinces there were not. Dominant overall was the province of Holland and its city of Amsterdam as the center of trade, commerce, finance, and culture. And it was in this the stately classical forms and sculpture of their new town hall that the burghers expressed their self-satisfaction and the phenomenal success of their endeavors. It was a supreme gesture of a virtual city-state proclaiming the hegemony of the Republic, and through its classical style, inviting comparison with the great cities of the ancient world. In the crisp definition and fine detail possible in a struck medal, Poel has recorded the actual scene of the inauguration. The Dam, crowded with people watching the procession of city fathers approaching the building, which fills the background with its measured elegance. Yet this is not quite enough to convince us of the magnitude of the event. Enter Mercury, god of commerce, who flies in from the right, extending his caduceus in a gesture of blessing over the town hall, while in his other hand he holds the familiar Dutch Liberty hat that bears on its brim words from Virgil's Aeneid, omnibus idem, the same for all, reminding us once again of the fierce pride of the Republic in its guarantees of liberty in a country surrounded by absolute monarchies. Classical allusions and divine or supernatural intervention do not stop with Mercury, however. Seated in the foreground is the figure Amphion, one of the twin sons of Zeus and Antiope, who played the lyre with such magical beauty that when he and his brother built the walls of Thebes, the stones followed his music and fitted themselves into place. If the classical references on the obverse are peripheral, they become central on the reverse in the elegant, detailed, and visually animated representation of the Argo, the legendary ship built with the help of Athena, commanded by Jason and manned by Greek heroes, had as its objective the quest for the Golden Fleece, which was hung in a grove in Colchis and guarded by a monstrous serpent. Here, the Argo symbolizes Dutch maritime power and commercial success blessed by the gods, while the figure of Jason holding the Golden Fleece represents the riches of the far-flung Dutch Empire being brought home to Amsterdam, shown in the background. A delightful conceit realized with great artistic skill by Poole. Not only the fruits of peace and prosperity were proper subjects for celebration in medals, war and its successful conclusion in peace treaties were also memorialized. The prevalence of silver as the material for medals reflects the affluence of their audience, as does the quantity of other types of often very large and elaborate silver objects made for the Dutch in the 17th and 18th centuries. 3 struck medals marking peace treaties are worth mentioning. Jan Lutma the Younger, son of the more famous Jan Lutma the Elder, whom we shall discuss in a moment, designed a particularly dramatic medal commemorating the Peace of BREDA in 1667, which ended the Second Anglo-Dutch War, there being 3 such conflicts between these 2 fierce commercial rivals. Whatever ambiguity there may have been about who was victor in each of these confrontations, one certainly did not issue a medal for losing. In Lutma's medal, the Dutch, in this case particularly the Council and Senate of Amsterdam, who commissioned the medal, viewed themselves as unquestioned victors over the English. The Belgic lion, growling angrily, straddles a cannon and tramples underfoot other implements of war, while in the background, the instrument of victory, the true and living wattle fence, the Dutch fleet, patrols and predominantly controls the sea. The same event is recorded in very different fashion by another prominent medalist, Christopher Adolphson, next please, whose medal for the Peace of BREDA has an interesting history and a notorious reputation, for ironically it may have played a peripheral role in causing a war. In order to force the English to conclude the Peace of BREDA, the Dutch mounted a daring naval operation by sending a powerful fleet into the Thames estuary, advancing up the Medway to within 20 miles of London, destroying shipping and several men of war en route, and finally taking in tow the great ship Royal Charles. Although Adolphson's medal ostensibly honors the cessation of hostilities between England and the Netherlands, much of the imagery could be interpreted as inflammatory, and apparently was so by the English, especially the King, Charles II, who was so angry that he insisted the dies be broken and the artist punished. Official complaints were registered, leading to the destruction of the dies by the provincial states of Holland, the offering of an apology and the denial that any insult was intended. At the same time, however, Adolphson was rewarded with a handsome compensation of 3,030 guilders, an act that further disturbed Charles. What had so infuriated this otherwise easygoing monarch? Not only did the king and his government resent the representation of the burning of the English ships on a medal supposedly commemorating the reconciliation of the two opponents, but Charles also perceived a number of derogatory personal references. There were those who construed the legend, procul hinc mala bestia regnus, go away from these states, you vicious beast, to refer to the king. Other details, such as the crown trampled underfoot, were also construed as insulting, and thus one of the possible incentives for the Third Anglo-Dutch War. So far, we've spoken only about struck medals, and as impressive as they are, the really distinctive and innovative Dutch medals are cast. As we have already indicated, many of the Dutch medalists were silversmiths, and it is from this craft that was derived a metallic technique unique to the Netherlands and to some extent not entirely understood. Medals made in this way are often described as being two cast shells soldered together. In fact, three methods exist by which relief surfaces can be formed in silver. In the repoussé process, a thin sheet of silver is beaten into a negative form or mold. In another process, embossing or chasing, the sheet of metal is beaten over a solid form in relief. Finally, in the casting process, molten metal is poured into a mold. It is possible for the Dutch medals that a combination of techniques was employed, but that in the final step, the obverse and reverse were cast as two thin shells and then soldered together, sometimes being joined by a thin band to form the rim. The interior is thus left hollow, the resulting metal being light in weight and less expensive. This method of production seems to have been developed in Amsterdam and is one of the most unique characteristics of Dutch medallic art. Most of the medals produced in this way were designed by three silversmiths: Jan Lutma the Elder, Peter van Abele, and Wouter Müller. The most famous of these, celebrated in his day and a close friend of Rembrandt, was Jan Lutma, who was one of the leading artists who brought to a climax a remarkable vocabulary of forms known as the auricular style, based on the word auricle, referring to the external ear and to the upper cavities of the heart, both of whose configurations resemble those employed in works identified by this term and representing the culmination of developments that began with certain Renaissance motifs, including the scroll work and strap work found in both architecture and the graphic arts. A cup from the Walters Art Gallery in Baltimore by Jan Lutma the Elder and dated 1639, and a famous ewer by Adam van Vianen dated 1614 are perfect examples of the auricular style. All of the surfaces are formed of elusive flowing shapes, including cartilaginous grotesque masks, fish faces, pools of liquid, or gelatinous plant forms. Lutma used such forms in his medals as well. Next, please. And they crept into the designs of other medallists. The reverse of Lutma's medal for the Peace of Munster in 1648 contains auricular shapes that add a delightful sense of movement to the surface, as well as a certain amount of whimsy to enliven the solemn and ponderous terms of the text. It is not through peripheral decoration, however, that the medals of Lutma, Van Abele, and Müller draw our attention, but through the powerful naturalistic portraits positioned in a three-quarter pose that establish a direct contact with the viewer, in contrast to the more abstract profile pose of the traditional medallic portrait. Next, please. The high relief also gives a distinct physicality to the images and links the sculptural nature of the medal with the painted or graphic portrait which was its source in most cases. No other type of portrait medal from any other country approaches the originality and force of these remarkable objects, which enjoyed so short a life, being produced only during the last half of the 17th century. In contrast to the often brittle, endlessly repetitive types of medallic self-adulation struck by the mints of ruling houses in other countries. The large cast Dutch portrait medals were normally limited to a select group of persons deemed worthy of such an honor. Members of the House of Orange were held in high esteem by most citizens of the Republic. But above all, it was the great naval heroes, those who by their courage and prowess had preserved Dutch superiority at sea and the control of an immense maritime empire, who deserved the highest honors. These were the superstars of the Dutch Golden Age, men who had, for the most part, risen from humble origins, who had often spent their youth in the rough and tumble, dissolute world of the common sailor, and who had attained the highest rank in their profession by means of hard work, discipline, and extraordinary ability. In a republic and a democracy as oligarchical and limited as it may have been, such men, Martin Tromp, his son Cornelius, Michiel de Ruyter, Piet Hein, Cornelius Evertson, as well as being heroes, represented the possibility of advancement open to any man. Their medals combine in high relief, forceful and realistic portraiture with formulaic and interchangeable representations of the sea battles that gained them their fame, surrounded by the Baroque trappings that set them apart from ordinary men. The putti, with trumpets and crowns representing fame, the panoplies of arms, the allegorical figures with classical overtones. The Dutch portrait medal was rather sparingly commissioned, since it was meant to honor very special individuals in a broadly distributed and public manner. Next, please. For the most part, it was therefore ordered by corporate or governmental bodies such as the provincial admiralties or states. Only in rare circumstances were medals produced with portraits of private citizens such as the revered poet Joost van den Vondel. Next, please. For the most part, the medals that served the needs of the average burgher were generic and related to the important events that occur in everyone's life: birth, marriage, and death. These, however, could have next, please. These, however, existed in abundance, were purchased for distribution at such events, and were personalized by engraved inscriptions. Only rarely, next please, would funerary medals show a portrait of the deceased. Various obverses and reverses could be combined according to the wishes of the client and were available from silversmiths who copied them from originals or sold them with the permission of their creators. They too form a body of material that is distinctly Dutch in technique and subject matter. The Dutch Golden Age was followed in the 18th century by the periwig period, the name alone drawn from the luxury and ostentation of court dress, giving some idea of a decline in greatness and a change in values. The originality and distinctive character of the Dutch medal, next please, would gradually be replaced toward the end of the 17th and into the 18th century by a taste for French art and culture, resulting in the proliferation of works that were generally smaller, struck, often tedious in style and dry in execution. Yet in its heyday, the Dutch medal, like so many other aspects of Dutch culture, established itself as unique and desirable, expressing the pride and defiance of a people who had challenged the world and emerged triumphant, even for so brief a moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Only Steve in his art history can bring Dutch medals to life like he has. I'm a hand surgeon, so I'm going to take a little different tact on medals. We saw the beautiful three-dimensional relief of the medals that Steve has presented, and I'm going to discuss engraved medals, which are really almost also uniquely Dutch and mainly were produced during the 17th century. Most of you may be familiar with what the term engraved medals from the famous De Pas medals that have been produced mainly through the royal family. And you can see an image of Elizabeth I on the right from 1616. And these do show up periodically in museums and at auctions. So I think a lot of people are familiar with this. These are generally referred to today as semi-engraved or simulated engraved medals. There was a lot of discussion about how these were made, whether they were actually engraved, whether they were pressed, whether they were cast, and nobody even today is still quite sure of the exact process. The details are extremely fine, and there are very small differences between metals of the same type. So that's an answer that we still don't know. De Pas was of Dutch origin, but worked mainly for the English nobility. And some of these techniques were also used in the Dutch Republic itself. The semi-engraved metals are one aspect, and they're relatively common. They could be produced in large numbers, relatively speaking. The metal on the left of Hector is a metal that's fairly well known and does show up fairly frequently. Less so are the more complicated metals, such as the one on the right, which is a silver gilt surround over a silver core. And these were much less frequently produced for individual events. The characteristics of semi-engraved metals or simulated metals is that they don't have a very sharp defined aspect to their numbers or their designs when you look at them under microscopic magnification. The letters and numbers tend to be somewhat blunted, and the lines of the details of objects when you get close enough really blur. So it's difficult to tell that that's a horse's head on the left unless you kind of go back a bit and look at it. They also are not as well characteristically defined, and you'll see areas where the engraving kind of loses its form and goes away. And this is what one sees with either a pressed or cast, very high pressure type of reproduction. Engraving tools were used mainly to etch plates, copper plates, and then to produce prints such as you see on the left. These are highly accurate and very detailed. And these tools also made their way over to metals themselves, just like they did to Dutch silver and other countries' silver. The artists use a Burin, which is essentially a sharp point tool to engrave a aspect of the metal that they're working on with different shapes. Using a Burin is a bit like landing an airplane. The artist would kind of come in at a low angle to the metal, engage the metal, use various degrees of force to cut the actual image that they wanted to accomplish, and then would gradually release the Burin at the end of the cut from the metal itself. Occasionally, they would want to have more effect, and they would stop a cut, which would pile up a small piece of silver or gold, just like a snowplow does when they're clearing a parking lot. The workshop of engravers were well known and quite busy. Those of the silversmiths and also engravers that did some metals were less known. But these metals, when they're actually at their point of virtuosity, are truly stunning. And you got to remember that these are basically one-off images or very, very small numbers of metals, each engraved by hand. This is a unique medal from 1645 with a figure of hope on the obverse and what looks like a prototypical whale as depicted in those times on the reverse. The details and ability to construct such a metal without error is really fairly astonishing. If you were going to cast a metal, you could work with the die or the process that you were going to work on, and if something wasn't going right, you could modify that and then make your metals for production. In engraved metals, you really didn't have that luxury. There was some ability to correct your mistakes, but overall, you had to be very precise, and you had to do it correctly the first time. Rembrandt, in one of his most famous etchings, made this image of Jan Lutma the Elder, which Steve has already talked about. He was certainly the most gifted and important silversmith and goldsmith in 17th century Netherlands. On the right, you can see actually a trowel that was used by one of the grandsons of the 4 burgemeesters or mayors of the city of Amsterdam to lay the first stone, and the accompanying medal that was given to the grandsons. There were 4 made for that event. This is actually the medal itself. It's solid gold, and it has that typical auricular design in the shield around the 3 crosses, the 3 X's of Amsterdam, in that auricular fashion that Steve has already discussed. This medal, of which there are 4 examples, this particular example was descendant from Valkenier, the grandson, through the Van der Pol family until a few years ago, and was engraved in 1648. The importance of the Amsterdam Town Hall has already been mentioned by Steve. You have to remember this was the largest structure in the Western Hemisphere when it was built. So this was an extremely important event, and one of the few events for which a gold medal was authorized. Engraved medals have some characteristics as opposed to what we saw with the Simi-Engraved medals. When you go to high magnification, the details don't really lose their characteristics, and one can see the image that the artist is trying to produce. In addition, there are smooth exits and uneven lines, as one would expect from a hand-carved piece of metal. And there's overlap. The underlying lines may be made first, and then the lettering would be put over that, and we'll take out the underlying lines. So if you see that, you can imagine that that's one layer and then a second layer of art placed on top of it. There are also different levels. So the artist could engrave, as you see on the right, the background deeper than the object, the rows that they want to have in the foreground. And also cross cuts where the cuts that the artist is making, such as in the upper tunic of this figure on the left, where you can see that different cuts overlap each other to make a different object or a different vision for the holder of the medal. There are also very sharp ends. This is when the Burin is either placed in or taken out, and you can see that the letters here contrast greatly to those of the Simi-Engraved medal. They're very sharp, they don't have any missing areas, and you can see the junction between the surface and the engraved aspect very clearly. There also were great masters and not great masters. They're probably, in a ratio perspective, 500 to 1,000 of the standard classic Dutch medals for every 1 engraved medal. So these are exceedingly rare. But even though they're rare, there were some that were made and produced in multiple copies, such as the medal on the left. This is an image from the Feast of Cana that can be seen fairly frequently and was engraved over and over again, even though it was hand engraved and not semi-engraved. So the quality is a bit lacking. When you compare it to the box, this is actually a metal box on the right. You can see it has some thickness. This is the lid of the box, made in 1632 by the monogrammist A.B., who we know from other art forms. And the quality of this engraving is superior to that on the left. This is the kind of quality that one may expect on some of the finest pieces of Dutch silver that were hand engraved. There are also important events, such as this Siege of Groningen in 1672. This is a great medal because you can see all the little bombs floating through the air, attacking the city, with all little men running around in the front. And then what's really a tremendous bird's eye view of the fortifications. One really isn't sure how people were able to construct these maps on the back of medals, and this was a fairly common practice, and be able to actually get everything right. So kind of a remarkable feat. There were related objects such as mini-Palquettes, which were engraved also by the same artists, that had high detail, and the exact purpose of these was not really known. They really weren't pieces of silver for use, and they really weren't metals, and they were kind of art objects on their own. There were famous engravers such as Michel Leblanc from the 1630 Caritas image. There were also very important historic events where they would engrave medals in both silver and gold. So the top medal is one of 2 or 3 known in gold. And this is to commemorate the barge path that was dug from Leiden to Utrecht in the Netherlands. You got to remember that a lot of commerce occurred on the canals in the Netherlands, and getting goods from one major city to another was a fairly significant feat. And so here we have the silver medal, which was probably given to more people, and then the very rare gold medal for very important people at the event. As Steve already mentioned, death medals are fairly frequent in Dutch art. Engraved death medals also come around, where they would have a set obverse, and then in silver would engrave the reverse with the name of the individual going forward. Only very rarely, such as in this solid gold death medal, which is extremely large, would somebody of very great importance be memorialized. These are in gold, these are exceedingly rare. I only know of 3 or 4 gold engraved death medals. There were great cities in the Netherlands outside of Amsterdam. Leiden, which is on the coast, produced quite a few medals in 1672. And this is a beautiful medal with the scene of Leiden, the cityscape on one side, and travelers returning from France on the other side. If you want to learn more about Dutch medals, all the medals you saw that are engraved are on the Newman Numismatic Portal site. I have about 120 medals on that site. You can look at that. And then I would also tell you to go buy Steve's books. He is a prolific author and has written some exceptional books, especially the Scher collection book on the right, which is a true tome. It weighs a ton and gives a really great overview of the subject as a whole. That's the end of the lecture, and if anybody has any questions, I'm sure Steve and I would be more than happy to answer them.
Yes, I have a question for Stephen on the soldered shells. Were they filled for rigidity, or do they remain hollow?
No, that's a good question. They are hollow. The kinds of metals that are filled are usually galvanos or electrotypes, and that's because there is an attempt to sort of, well, to, I guess, imitate the heft of an original, or to try and convince someone that what they're holding is an original. But these are hollow.
Are they subject to bending and dents?
I've seen so many, and I don't think I've seen a single one that is, because it's possible that most of them, when that rim is added between the 2 shells, it holds it rigidly. Now, that doesn't mean that it couldn't be subject to being sort of bent in if you press, the center and it was hollow inside. But I've never seen that.
Yeah, well, don't do it.
I'd add a comment to that. What's interesting about the plaquette-penningen, which is the hollow metals that you're discussing, is they always have a hole in them. If you look carefully at these, you can tell if they're later kind of solid cast versus the true hollow metal, because they have to have a hole somewhere in it to let the gases out while they're annealing the 2 shells together. So all of these will have a small hole, usually at the bottom of the bust.
Oh, that's a very good point. I forgot to mention that. Thank you. Yeah, that's very important.
Next.
I actually have a question. Other people may know this on this chat, but how were these beautiful art objects displayed? Were they like on a shelf? Were they framed and put on the wall? How were they treated as objects?
Well, I'm not sure I can answer that because I've not read any sort of description, I mean, contemporary description of a collection and how it was kept. I think that objects of this sort could be displayed in two ways, really. It could be, as I do with some, put on stands and shown publicly, but for the most part, coins and medals were parts of cabinets, and so they were kept in specially built pieces of furniture with trays and inserts that were to the size of the medal. And because usually, they exist in a collection in some quantity. Now, originally, let's say if you attended a wedding or there was a birth or there was a funeral, these would be available to the guests or participants, maybe in limited fashion. So you would take your medal and bring it home. And from there on, I don't know what happened to them, except that they ended up in our collections.
So there are some examples like the Tylers Museum in the Netherlands, which has one of the best collections of medals in existence. The person who started that museum actually was collecting them contemporaneously. And so those medals are in exceptional condition. And he actually had a whole series of cabinets made to house his medals. And that's why they're in such perfect shape. It's a wonderful place to go visit and peruse for a couple hours. But I think most of these medals were one-off for events. Certainly the engraved medals were, and they would probably be put in in a cabinet or something, and most of the time forgotten about, I would think, and not really displayed on a wall per se.
It's interesting you mentioned the Tylers because there was a conference. There was a conference in the Netherlands on numismatics. I'm not sure it was that. And the Tyler had a machine where you could make your own medal. It was only in paper, but it was a machine where it photographed you like a photo booth. And then it came out and you could choose your own reverse. And it would come out as a piece of cardboard with the two sides on it. And everybody was having a lot of fun with that.
Sometimes these cabinets could be actually quite small. So you could keep, the Walters, we have one small one that belonged to Cosimo de' Medici, and we have others that are, just small size. We don't know who they belong to, but so you could have the big ones, a big cabinet that had all kinds of shells, but also you could have a small one. Maybe you were only interested in sort of 20 of them or something to keep at hand. So they could be in all different sizes. And then of course that you could just have on your desk or something with some of your favorite ones. So there were all kinds of ways to access these.
I was wondering if any of the folks on the call, medals were made, universally throughout Europe, but really probably for a large part in the Netherlands, in Germany, and to a lesser degree, England. But engraved medals were certainly probably 95% were made in the Dutch Republic, and a few in Augsburg and in England, but really they're rare as hen's teeth. And anybody have any idea why it didn't spread more widely throughout Europe? And obviously Italy, probably a little earlier, had a very prolific metal production capabilities.
What was the process for producing an engraved metal? You're using the graver into what kind of metal to do that? You're not talking about one-off engraved metals.
Yeah, we are.
You are. You're talking about hand engraving into the metal that is the final product.
That's absolutely correct. So a lot of these are unique. A lot of them were done in small groups. So Lutma did 4 for the town hall. He did 3 for another medal, the Hunter Cooper medal. You know, the medalists would, and you could see, because sometimes there are 3 birds, 3 little birds on one medal, and then on another example, there's 4 little birds. So you can tell the difference sometimes where the engraver just took a little liberty, but they're amazingly identical. So there's minute differences, but they were definitely hand engraved, most of these. They were one-off.
Wow. I think you've answered your own question on why it didn't spread.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Frankly.
But Peter, there is some question, I think, there always has been some question about the DePass medals, because
Yes.
they do exist in greater numbers than, and I always wondered, of course, I always wondered about this on ancient coinage too, that you had to strike every single one. But the DePass medals exist in enough quantity so that to think about them being individually engraved, I mean, they're really more like tiny etching plates or engraving plates.
Yeah.
I mean, you could print from them. And in fact, Goltzius made tiny little portraits with plates, with an etched plates that are sort of very similar. So it's still, I think, and Peter, you can probably talk about this, it's still something of a mystery about how DePass medals were made.
Yeah, so when they made prints of them, obviously they would engrave them in reverse, right? And these medals were not engraved to make prints, because otherwise, you know, they would look backwards. But yes, Goltzius definitely had engraved basically medallic type etchings that you can buy on print, on paper or on vellum, mostly on paper. There's definitely had to be in some type of mechanism, which we, as you say, don't understand. Mark Jones has written a little bit about this. We really don't know how they did it. I did buy recently a DePass medal that was only one-sided. And what was interesting, I'm trying to figure out, and that you can see the obverse type from the back of the medal, which is flat, but there's a little area where you can see the front of the medal. And I think it was Charles I DePass medal, Charles second DePass medal. And I think that may give us a clue as to how they made it. I haven't really spent time yet with it, but there must have been some amazing mechanism. And also these counters, you see these small quarter size little pieces of silver that came in a little box that they would use for gaming counters. Those were for all intents and purposes, the same technique. But that being said, all the DePass medals in the world, you put them together. Richard Faulkner did a nice study on this. You still only have about 60 of them, 70 of them, maybe a little more, maybe 80. So they're still very rare.
In terms of the amount of work that went into these, I know from reading about the work of French metal engravers in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, making dies for struck metals, which is of course a different process and might have required more work than the hand engraved metals you're showing us. It took several months to engrave by hand the dies for a struck metal. And so a productive guy working hard might produce 4 dies in a year. And if you assume that the ones you're showing, the hand engraved ones you're showing were not quite that much work because they're not doing quite as deep engraving and not as much relief and contrast and so on, still, it was probably a lot of work to produce 6 or 8 of those in a year.
Yeah, these artists were super fast. So I have a Dutch dealer friend who, Dick Entlich, who's really, he's a T5, he's an expert. He does some metals, but he basically sells, cups or beakers that haven't been engraved. They made these things at a prolific rate. So a silversmith, once they got the beaker made and they had to engrave the beaker with, let's say, a coat of arms, and they could do it in about 45 minutes. They've got some documentation for that. So even though you think it would take a long time, they were so, I don't know how they did it or how they got to be so good, but they could do this stuff quite quickly. Now, obviously, some of the very intricate metals, must have taken some significant time.
Yeah.
And dies, of course, you have to invest some time in those.
Yeah, I don't really agree when you said that the engraved metals never went anywhere else, because they did. It was just an 18th and early 19th century phenomenon. They were very common in the United States, Britain, a few other countries, mostly as society and school award medals.
Yeah, no, I agree.
They're all over the place.
Yeah, So there are, yeah, definitely. I have later metals from the 18th, 19th, even 20th century that are either machine engraved or hand engraved. There are not that many that are hand engraved.
A lot of them,
These
like I
metals?
said, a lot of school awards and society membership, like all the Tammany Society medals of from the 18th and early 19th century are hand engraved, and they would crank these out in large numbers.
You're
Scott,
talking about the name?
what-
Aren't you
what-
talking about the name, Scott?
No, the whole thing.
The whole thing? Okay.
The Washington Peace Medals are
peace
engraved.
medals,
Yes.
We actually have a question in the chat here. Can you comment on the use of, I don't know if I'm going to pronounce this right, but tetragrammation on many Dutch medals? I don't know if I said that correctly.
Tetragrammaton.
Thank you, Scott.
Interpret, please.
4 letters of God's name, the Yud Hey Vav Hey,
Oh,
which gives you Jehovah, for those who don't know.
yeah,
Yeah, that's quite common, I think.
yeah.
We have another question. Maybe you can pull up the list of books again. Jan Monroe would like to see that. And he
Sure.
also commented, is it possible that they had assistants copy the medal once they did the first one? I'm assuming that's for the engraved medals.
I mean, all you got to do is go on Google and type in Steve Scher and they all show up.
As long as my portrait doesn't.
Yeah. I didn't see that, Steve, when I was looking through to get these images for this slide. I didn't see
Oh,
your.
good, good.
Was Currency of Fame ever issued hardbound?
Oh, yes.
Oh, I
Yes,
would
it
love
was
to have
both
that.
hardbound and soft cover. I think that the one in the picture is hardbound.
Yeah, that's hardbound. That's my wall.
Thank you.
In answer to the question about assistants, I always sort of assumed, since you could go into for the Dutch medals for different events, or for the medals commemorating the admirals, or anybody for that matter, but for ones that had interchangeable images for obverse and reverse, those could be ordered in the way you wanted. And then, of course, as Peter mentioned too, in the blank space, as you get in commemorative medals these days, you could write in the event. You could have it engraved in the event. So I had this picture always of being able to go to an authorized, let's say, silversmith shop, unless it was the shop of the person who made the medal, like Van der Bailey, but that they possibly licensed out to other silversmiths the possibility of being able to sell those medals. And you go into the shop and they would show you various obverses and reverses, and you could choose the combination. Certainly that would have happened in the shops of the actual artists who made the original. Whether they did license or allow other silversmiths to do that, I don't know. That's something that may be recorded in documentation, but that was an assumption which I begin to question anyway.
Well, certainly, if you look at J.W. Frederick's book from 1947, where he lists all the Pottenfennig, the hollow metals, there was a robust business at making your own. So they would take the obverse of one and stick it with the reverse of another, and they'd sometimes have 2 obverses together, and they would make a whole industry out of this. And I think there was certainly some evidence that it was, you could basically make, kind of custom order what you wanted back then.
But you would have to have the let's say whatever it was, the mold or whatever.
Yeah, but I think there were molds that were very high quality, and then there were molds after molds that were not as high quality, and you could see that in the marketplace today. And I'm sure there were basically copycat folks running around making medals for whoever wanted them of the non-high quality stuff.
Yeah. But I assume that
like
since
fake
almost
coins.
all of them, assume that since almost all of them are silver, they weren't exactly cheap. I mean, silver would have been a fairly costly metal.
Yeah.
Could I go back to a couple of questions that had to do with DePasa? who I'm particularly interested in. The Walters has a really handsome gold one of the Elizabeth Stewart and her husband and son, which sort of is my pathway into this. One is on the he's a great, they comes from a great family of printmakers, just exquisite prints by Crispin van der Passa and other members of the Magdalena van der Passa. And what I'm not familiar with, so here you have a family of great printmakers just in terms of engravings in general, you know, so the technique, the control, you know, is sort of built into the DNA almost. But I'm not seeing this later in the century where people who are, first of all, great, you know, sort of printmakers, then are actually working in the medallic form, which sort of interests me. There was also the question about why the difference between the more sculpted tradition in Italy and the more in the frequency of the engraved form in Holland. And I never thought about that before, but I just offer the thought that the actual to see it in relationship to the tradition and importance of sculpture in the countries. And in the 16th century and early 17th century, sculpture had in the Netherlands a very robust tradition, but that kind of petered out a bit. Whereas in Italy, the sculpted tradition, you know, sort of continued. There's great sculpture from the middle of the 17th century. So there may be a little bit of the play of aesthetics, you know, sort of there. Of what they're interested in. But just to go back to the de Passa, I'm just wondering, are there later in the century examples which I know nothing about? I mean, this isn't quite my area, where you have the great engravers on a paper turning to medallic art. That I just don't know. It's a good, interesting question.
You know, I think a lot of the, certainly when I'm visiting my friend, the silver dealer, most of the engraved pieces of silver that he has, you know, whether it's a beaker or a bowl or whatever, they don't know who made it. And they can be super high quality. So I'm sure there was a lot of overlap between the etcher, you know, an etcher, an engraver, silversmith who worked only on silver, also worked on metals. I'm sure they did everything. I mean,
I was thinking of people not so much on metal, but simply, you know, who made great prints like Magdalena van der Passa or something. This is prints on paper, you know, whether, I mean, that's where the great, you know, the use of sort of engraving and etching is. I mean, for example, Rembrandt. So it's just interesting to think, because Van der Passa, they worked in etching and engraving, but I mean on paper. That's where their general fame is.
Yeah, well, Crispin, the father of Simon, yeah, he only worked on paper as far as I know.
Yeah.
Simon really only worked on metal, and when he went to Denmark after he was finished in London, he was the chief engraver for the King of Denmark. I don't think I know of anything where he did anything on paper. So the must have. And Rembrandt, you know, etched Lutma, but Lutma, I don't think he engraved Rembrandt. I mean, I think they had their separate little fiefdoms, I suppose, but I don't know.
No, that's what's so remarkable about the de Passa family, is that the same graphic medium method was turned into so many forms.
Great. Well, we're at 2:05, so unless there are any other burning questions, Steve and I really appreciate your joining us. And
yeah, thank you. It was great to see all of you.
Yeah. I did have one more, if I could.
Yeah.
Are you familiar at all with the Decatur family medal, which is a two-sided engraved medal? One side has the coat of arms in reverse, and the other is a family scene, but as a normal image.
No, I don't think I've ever seen an image of that Decatur family.
Okay, it was sold by Sotheby's a few years ago, but it's one of those things that nobody seems to know much about. Or again, it's in, or why it is in one side reverse and one not.
Okay. Peter, I have one offer for you to make. This is Jerome from the Netherlands.
Hey, Jeroen.
Hi.
Not alles.
If you have any questions about special questions, I can take it to the Rijksmuseum and ask them to find it out. So, for instance, there was one question about how medals are stored. Basically, we know that they were all in trays, basically, or in closets. They were flat. And if there are any other questions, for instance, how to engrave them or who were famous or not, I think you know more than enough of that. But if you have a special question, you can just take it to the laboratory or go to the curator and find it out for you.
For those of you who don't know, Jeroen is a dedicated Rijksmuseum helper. Assist, almost, I think, the curator basically at this point in medals.
Actually, I am that, so.
You are, yeah.
Yeah, just promote it.
Oh, okay. Well, it's even better.
Can I sneak in a style question? Hello?
No?
Yeah.
For Stephen, the vogue for non-profile, non-classical profile, the 3/4, how long did that last? And why do you think it went? Was it because of the technique of making the metal, flattening the image?
No, I don't think it ever went. To some extent, it's related to its ancestry and coinage. And there, of course, with coins, it's a practical matter of, in most cases, not having the same kind of high relief that can be abraded. And it's just, I mean, it's a complicated question about the difference between the profile, which also has a symbolic value. But you know, I see the image behind you. I have medals of that, or medallions, which of that probably is, which are also 3/4. I think that it was a pose that maybe wasn't traditional, but never died. I mean, it was always, and it goes back. It goes very far back in medallic history.
Well, I don't remember seeing it again until David d'Angers, and then it died out again. They returned to the mausoleum, and only Art Nouveau and Jugendstil revived it.
Yeah, I have to sort of think back, because that came to my mind because I just actually purchased a large terracotta medallion, a portrait of Honoré Daumier by a French artist, and that is in profile, but it made me look at other medals of that sort with 3/4 views, and I did remember some from an earlier period, and I'm trying, and then it's gone out of my mind, but it's something that was, I think, always a choice and was chosen from time to time at almost any period.
To me, I think the late revival was medalists working from photographs. Because I know my man up here who did the Mahler, Kunitsky, most of his best stuff is working from photographs of the famous people, which were not especially available to the 18th century, 17th century.
Yeah, but for the Dutch, of course, they used they were using paintings or etchings, so there would be 3/4 views.
Well, those are masterful.
This is Peter van Alphen. I just have a quick comment to make. The ANS actually has a rather significant collection of 17th century Dutch medals, probably several hundred, but sadly, these have never been accessioned or photographed for the most part. So at some future date, I'm hopefully with Jeroen and Steve and Peter's help to get these cataloged and photographed and then put online. So
Absolutely. Yes, that's a surprise, because they are, and they've been there a long time.
Yeah. A very long time.
Oh, yeah, that would be a great thing to do, because just knowing that they're there would be extremely valuable, and having them online. Yeah, that would be what
You
I'm
will love,
certainly available to help if you wish.
oh, you will love it. You know, one of the most famous ones, that's the most rare ones, is the one of the first of the Dutch Republic. That's actually in the tray of the ANS.
Yeah.
And it's the, we call it the Turfschip of BREDA, which is the first medal that was actually made in gold, issued by the Dutch Republic. About the first big victory. There are 5 or 6 known. And it's already put in the tray in 1908, I believe, if I'm right, Peter.
Yeah.
We just found it. We were surprised to see it. And it's actually, it's a masterpiece. I think, Peter, you have one, right?
You're talking about the gold one, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of the earliest medals. I think there are 3 or 4 or 5 known, very few. Yeah.
What was the subject of it? What is being represented?
Oh, it's actually it's a Trojan horse victory. So they put in a ship made out of turf. I don't know what turf means. Peter, do you know what it is in English?
Yeah, it's it's probably the same. I mean, it like peat or
something like. Well, at least it used to be heating.
organic.
Heat. The city was occupied by the Spanish, of course, and they were putting in a ship with whatever you call peat or something, and hidden in the ship were 76 or 75 soldiers, and they climbed out in the night, surprised all the defenders, opened the gates, and took the city. There was actually, I think there were no casualties or 1 casualty. I think there was 1 casualty of the Dutch that drowned because he fell off the ship. And then they took the city. Well, those medals, those gold medals, were issued to the soldiers. And so there must have been 76 of them. And they were actually had a value of 24 guilders, which was, from my head, I think 2 or 3 months wage. And the funny thing is, you can see a country that goes up, that strives and becomes better and better and richer, because, as Peter also said, people from a common background could become an admiral, and people that were doing soldiers that were heroes were getting golden medals. Well, if you look at when the Dutch Republic went down, so let's say the 18th century, then the poets and the noblemen got the gold medals, and the common background guys didn't got anything. So there you see a nice eagerness of the heroes being rewarded. And that medal, that specific medal, was the first medal being issued by the, what we call Staten-Generaal, so the common, it's late here, so I can't translate it easy, but the, yeah, that's the one, yeah.
Yeah, so 1590, yeah.
Well, that's yours, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, that's the medal. That is the most, actually, from the 16th, 17th century. This is the most important medal.
Oh. Huh.
Okay. Well, I guess I got to go do some other stuff today. So.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
That was wonderful. I can't wait to photograph the ANS medals.
New project.
Happy to help.
Next Money Talks is going to be Irina Soto, and she's going to be talking on the gold solidus of the late 4th century in Egypt. So come back in February for that Money Talks.
Congratulations, Jeroen, on your new post. That's awesome.
Thank you, Peter.
Yes.
Yeah.
See you later. And happy to help out with the medals of the NS.
Yeah.
Okay, cheers.
Bye.
Excellent, guys.
Thank you, everyone.
And check out those comments. They really love you guys. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great weekend.
Next time.
Bye-bye.
Great presentation, guys.
Thank you.
This lecture has been made available to you courtesy of the American Numismatic Society. Since 1858, the ANS has supported research and education in numismatics and the history of money. With a collection of over 800,000 objects, an extensive library, a dynamic publishing arm, and ever-improving online research resources, we have become one of the largest numismatic institutions in the world. If you wish to support the ANS and the work we do, you can join as a member and become a part of this historic community. Go to numismatics.org/membership to see options and prices.